Now that we know how to create matrices, vectors, and scalars, how do we reference an element in any of those? Scalars, we're expert. Vectors, we'll do a quick review. But matrices is all brand new. You have to first think of what type of arrays you're trying to reference. The variable always has a dimension. It's a blank by blank. What do I mean by blank? It's the number of rows. Does it have 2 rows, 1 row, 6 rows? That's the first number we want to hear. And then by columns. How many columns do you have? The smallest array that exists is a 1 by 1, and we call it a scalar. The next size up is a vector. It's a 1 by n or an n by 1. The difference here makes it a row vector versus a column vector. My first example here is a 1 by 5. My second example is a 3 by 1. Notice that a scalar is a vector. A 1 by 1 is still a vector. The last and biggest category is a matrix, an R by C array. R will be the number of rows and C the number of columns. In this example, I have an 8 by 7. A scalar is a vector and a vector is a matrix. Going the other way around is not necessarily true. But the big picture here is all of these are arrays. If someone asks you what kind of arrays are you using, what's the dimension of your array? These are what you want to answer. Scalar, vector, matrix, with a specific dimension. If at one point in your project you yourself are not even sure of what happened in the past, maybe you didn't create the vector or the matrix, maybe it got loaded by somebody else and you need to know the dimension, always look at your workspace. If the variable is small enough, MATLAB actually displays the values, like R and X are little vectors. If it's a scalar, MATLAB actually displays the scalar, of course. But if it's a matrix, notice MATLAB runs out of room and starts doing the dimension by default. If you still want to push it one step further, you can click right and click size. Then you have the actual row by column dimension. You also notice I have a 3 dimension in there, 100 by 200 by 300. Imagine a Rubik cube. You have a number of rows, number of columns, but you also have different layers behind it. Why not? Now referencing data in a vector has been done. Remember that we have a variable, for example data, and it has a lot of values. If you're trying to do math on the vector all at once, keep in mind element by element operator might be needed. If you're trying to use built-in functions, MATLAB has a lot of them. Sum, min, max, mean, all you provide is the variable name. Even sorting, it does it ascending by default, but you might want to do descending. In that case, you would add the word descend. But still, you're using a built-in function. What if you wanted to reference a single element? What if you wanted to only use the first element and the 5th element in an equation? You would have to introduce what we saw was an index, a little location, the location of the number you wanted to use. So here I'm adding element 1 plus half of element 5. If the user provides the location, maybe in a prompt, then you can still use it. Remember to use the parentheses and inside of that the actual index location. So we did this in a previous tutorial with the marathon. I wanted to see position 9. I prompted the user, I stored the value in a k variable, and I displayed it. We also extensively went over that when we traversed. Traversing is all about looking at one little element at a time. So we traverse using a for loop, but the logic of referencing one element is still the parentheses and that index inside. What happens when we switch to matrices though? Now we have rows and columns. What will min, max, sort, and mean do, if they will still work? How about referencing a single element? Can the user be responsible for creating a matrix from scratch? We've seen how to create a vector from user input. Is it possible to do a matrix? The best way to answer any of those questions is always to go experiment in MATLAB. Remember, the command window is there for that. Well, I have a bunch of variables in my workspace. Let's see Q. What does the max of Q mean? Q is 2 rows and 30 columns. Why is it so weird? I mean, I was expecting the max of the entire thing. Hey. But MATLAB doesn't. MATLAB always will, and always will, look at columns individually. So it looked at column number 1 and gave me the maximum of that column. We never actually saw what was in Q, so let's just display Q quickly. It had 30 columns, and since that's too big to display in one screen, MATLAB wraps, which is fine. But the first column had 97 and 95, so the maximum is 97. The second column, 48 and 80. 80 was the maximum. Let's take the fourth column, 91 and 79. MATLAB found 91. So MATLAB will not give you automatically the maximum of the entire matrix. It works column by column. If you want the maximum of these values, what could you do? Well, I want the maximum of this. Might as well do it. So I want the maximum of Q. In that case, MATLAB goes column by column, but that only creates a vector, so the maximum of vector, we're back to what we know, will give you only one value. The min will work the same way, the mean as well. How about sort? Let's experiment with sorting. Will MATLAB sort all the values into one huge column? What do you think? No. MATLAB again looks at column by column individually. It's almost like MATLAB detaches every single column, analyzes it, and puts it back together. So it did sort ascending wise each column individually. 48 was less than 80, 14, 42, 79, 91, and so on. It wouldn't even make sense to start sorting the sort of Q, because if you're sorting this again, you're still having a lot of columns. Now how about referencing a single element? Let's work with W now. W is 5 by 5, 25 elements. But what if I only wanted to look at this one? Well, where is it? It's 1, 2, 3, fourth row, and second column. Think of the game Battleship. You always have to give a latitude and a longitude. It's exactly the same with matrices. You always have to provide a row and a column position. So in order to access the 0.47, my variable name comes first, but then the row number, 4, and the column number, 2. Something weird happens if you do W of 7. It doesn't crash. But how did MATLAB get 0.2511? It's this value. It all comes down again to column by column. The first thing MATLAB did is it went through column 1. So number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then it ran out of room, so it goes to the next column. 6, 7. That is another way of referencing each element of your matrix. But in that case, you have to know a kind of a different position idea. If I wanted to reference this value, instead of me counting, I'd rather go fourth row, fourth column. W44. Much easier. So of course, you can still use the functions min, max, mean, and sort. But to reference a single element, the easiest way is to go by the row number first, the column number second. Can the user be responsible for creating? Of course. That will be a more complicated example that I will look at in the future. Right now, we're going to go do simple examples. The first one assumes that we have a matrix, two-dimensional, with 2 columns. The first column are the marathon results for female, the second column is for males. We want to prompt as your what category, male or female, and what place they want to see, first place, second place, and so on. Of course, we want to display. Using the operators, brackets, semicolons, I created a matrix. To be sure what it looks like, I can always take off my semicolon and run. So I have two columns, female is the first column, male is the second column. Algorithm-wise, I'm going to prompt female or male. I'm going to prompt which place they want to see, and I'm going to show the time. This will imply an if statement, so I can already write it a little bit. Prompt for female or male, I'll call that gender. Prompt which place. But now I got to do the time. Now if it's a female, that means that the gender variable is equal to an F. Else is the default male, so I'm not coding anything here. To show is an fprintf. But the big question here is, what do I write? We have the gender, we have which place, but now I need to write to tell MATLAB, go get the value that I want out of here. So the first reflex is to go get your variable. It's obviously in the database variable, but I don't want to print all of them, just a specific row and a specific column. I can't actually hard code the row. Depends. Do I want first place, second place, third place, fourth place? If I want this one, it's the fifth place of the females. If I want this one, it's the 8th place. So that's the variable which place. The user will give you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, will give you a value. So I'm going to use that. Now since my if statement already knows I'm in the female category, I can actually hard code the 1. That will tell MATLAB, go get that place in the row and that column 1. It's the identical statement for male, but what changes? The 2. If it's male, I want MATLAB to reference the second column. See if it works. Female first place, 0.7133. Male fourth place, 1.01. Female seventh place, 1.13. So it works. Automatically MATLAB references the correct row and the correct column. This is a very basic example, but this is important. If we want to reference something inside a variable, always write the variable first, then in parentheses the coordinates. Index of the row, index of the column. Now let's improve a little bit. Complexity now is medium, but we're going to think more and code less. So it's a win-win. Do not use a single if statement in there. Do the same thing. So what I'm asked to do is basically delete that part, and make it so this part still works. But how am I supposed to make this change from 1 to 2 depending on male-female? Well, how about asking for a 1 or a 2? So we're kind of dumbing it down. We're no longer asking for a string, but now the gender will have a value, a numerical value I can use. Without knowing it, the user specifies the column. Tricky. So gender will be the column number. Run. When I type in a 1, the user has no clue. That's okay. We're actually typing the column that we want. Column 1, 5th row. Column 2, 5th row. So programming wise, there's a lot involved in just asking nicely for data. 3 lines of code and my database can grow. If I all of a sudden have more people coming in, I'll try to keep the order adequate, but I can keep going. Notice the bottom of the code doesn't change, and yet I'm adding another person in there. It's a win-win. Okay, to conclude, referencing a scalar, simply use the variable name. Referencing a vector, try to use the index to tell MATLAB which specific element you want to look at. Referencing a matrix, we need 2 indices. The row number is always first, the column number is always second. This allows programs to have databases of values instead of a huge if statement. And this is very useful to reference existing value, but also to create vectors or arrays. We are going to do this soon.